Holy crap, you drop anything in this airplane, it just goes straight into a black hole, I swear. Where the heck did that nut go? Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Now somebody's calling me? Ugh. Oh, gosh. Ugh. All right. Hello?
Hey there, buds. This is Travis at Ferry's Airplanes there.
Yeah, that's me. What can I do for you?
All right, on, yeah. Can you take a PA-12 all the way to Alaska, eh?
Where even is Alaska? I thought it was a desert. Crap, don't you have to cross Russia to get there? No, you idiot, that's Canada. Do they even speak English there? I don't even have a passport.
Oh, yeah. That'll be no problem. Yeah, absolutely. We can do that for you, no problem.
Oh, right about it, yeah. Can you do it in the next couple weeks then, eh?
Perfect. See you then. Yep, see you then. Yep, bye.
Okay, that was a bit dramatic. Hello everyone, welcome back to Average Aviator. I'm Travis, and of course I knew where Alaska was, but I can definitely say that I had no idea how to get a small airplane there. The good thing was that I still had a month before the airplane and the weather were ready to make the journey, so I took the time to thoroughly research and figure out what I was doing. I found some great resources out there, like this AOPA article that I studied in great detail waiting for my expedited passport to come in. One of the things I learned that was required to operate an aircraft internationally is an FCC or radio telephone operator license. Although that sounds important and hard to obtain, the hardest part about it is navigating the FCC website. The other difficult part is giving the government 35 of your hard-earned and already highly taxed dollars for an email saying you now have the permit to operate a radio in a foreign country. A permit which literally no one will check. In any case, I made a whole list of all the supplies and paperwork that was required and worked with the owner to ensure everything was in order before we both flew out to Wichita, Kansas. The seller picked us up from the airport there in Wichita and took us to the private strip where the airplane was hangared. November 2923 Mike is a 1946 Piper PA-12 Supercruiser, which is designed by Piper as a bigger version of the J5, which was a sister to the famous J3 Cub. Though the PA-12 is technically a 3-seat airplane, it accomplishes this with a 32-inch wide rear seat, so unless you have 2 infants along for the ride, it's realistically a 2-seat airplane with considerable shoulder room. This PA-12 is used as a seaplane for a while, and so it had its engine upgraded to 160 horsepower Lycoming from its original 115 horsepower. It also had a bunch of other modifications that I'm sure PA-12 gurus will recognize, like the seaplane clear doors on both sides, and a high RPM, low-speed, fixed-pitch seaplane propeller. One of the things that was not improved, however, was the dismal 26-gallon fuel capacity. It had 2 15-gallon tanks with only 13 gallons usable. Overall, though, 2-3 Mike was in great shape, and I took off from the private strip and headed up to Newton, Kansas for a longer runway to practice landings. I used that flight to get a good feel for the airplane before we set out on the long journey the next day. That night, me and the owner were put up in the seller's treehouse, I guess is the best way to say that. It's kind of like a camp, kind of like a treehouse, I don't really know, but it was very interesting accommodation. The next morning, after a quick gas station breakfast of champions, we packed up the airplane and took off on the long trek north. The first stop was in Brooks County, Kansas, a mere 123 nautical miles away, but it took us nearly 2 hours to get there. I immediately realized that I had severely underestimated how long it would take to go all the way to Alaska. I verified the fuel and oil burn, and we set out northwest once again. Our next leg took us to Oshkosh, Nebraska, where there was a gas station right across the road from the ramp. We grabbed a quick lunch while trying to figure out the best way to tackle the afternoon storms that were growing in the distance. I also noted the hardware store that was in the same parking lot as the airport. It would later save my dumb ass after I dropped a fuel dipstick into the tank on a ferry sometime later, but that was a problem for future Travis. And current Travis, or I guess past Travis at this point, had to divert a good bit north to get between some menacing storms in western Nebraska. We skated between 2 large cells without issue, but were getting beat up by turbulence. I was mostly just letting the airplane rise and fall with the air currents, keeping a relatively constant airspeed, but somewhere around Torrington, I hit a very large updraft that rocketed the PA-12 up at 1,500 feet a minute. I was gaining altitude rapidly, so I pulled just a little bit of power and pushed forward, and the speed increased. I did this because I was expecting a similar downdraft to come at any moment. Interestingly, an equivalent downdraft never came, and I was marveling at the blistering 105 knots ground speed. But then I looked up and saw these odd, puffy underside stratus clouds a few thousand feet above us. I immediately recognized these clouds as the same type that I got absolutely rocked by in this exact area in the Mooney a year or so before, knowing that in the clear air underneath those those benign-looking clouds lay some severe turbulence, I pulled the power fully to idle and tried to descend. I quickly rolled the airplane into a steep bank to try to kill the lift and hopefully find the edge of the updraft to get out of it. Immediately after I rolled into the bank, the turbulence nailed us, and boy did it give us a whack. My head hit the ceiling, but thankfully the maneuver had worked and we finally started descending. Back to the normal 65-knot cruise and only constant, mild turbulence. I believe what we hit was the beginning of a thunderstorm, but in such an early stage, it looked just like a normal cloud until we got under it. In any case, we progressed west over Camp Guernsey to avoid the active restricted area to the north. As we turned northward, the winds ended up directly in our face, and I watched the ground speed slow to 35 knots. The controller noted our dismal ground speed and was left flabbergasted when I told him we were headed to Alaska, a feat he must have thought impossible with our ground speed on his screen. As I progressed to our fuel stop of Douglas, Wyoming, I was continually doing math on our ground speed and fuel burn. However, as we neared Douglas, we got in range of the AWOS weather radio that was calling 30-knot crosswinds for both runways, something that definitely was not predicted. I then realized that though I had enough fuel to get there, I didn't have enough fuel to figure out I couldn't land safely in 30-knot crosswinds and then divert somewhere else. So I decided to land on the nice grass runway conveniently aligned with the wind at Thomas Memorial in Glendo, Wyoming. Okay, 1 second. I gotta address this. It may seem like I was overcautious with fuel on this trip, and I can assure you, I was definitely overcautious with fuel. But one of the things you might find if you Google the airplane's N number is an article from 2016 where a pilot ended up in a field because he ran it out of fuel. I didn't run out of fuel on this trip, so perhaps I was the correct amount of overcautious with fuel. Either way, Glendo ended up being a really cool tiny town, and we stayed the night to wait out the winds. Our first day was over. The next morning, we got a ride to the airport and were able to get the first use of the AutoFuel STC as well as the Airframe Alaska liquid containment bags. I mean, seriously, God forbid the government realize that there's a frickin' useful fuel canister out there. Anyway, we made a quick hop to Douglas for fuel and coffee, but pressed on after a very short stop. We worked our way up the Wyoming Front Range and were making pretty dang good progress on this beautiful VFR day until we had a in-flight physiological emergency that prompted an early landing at South Bighorn. I do love this airport because it's got lots of cool firebombers around like this KC-97 we parked next to. But soon after we fueled up, we were off once again, our flight path taking us over the west side of Bighorn Canyon, which is one of my favorite places to fly. I mean, come on, just look at this place. It's easily one of the coolest places in the lower 48. We progressed on to Lewiston, Montana, where we got lunch and saw a Huey taking off, which was pretty cool. Then we took off for the last time that day, headed to Cutbank, Montana as the fuel stop for the night, as the next day would start with the crossing into Canada. Cutbank is a really cool airport. It's got 24-hour FBO access with sleeping rooms, showers, an old control tower you can go into, and even a mini museum. It also has the best crew car I've ever experienced. I think it's an early 90s Cadillac, but it drove like a boat through butter. We took the Cadillac into town for some dinner, and when we returned to the airport, we just had to look around some of the old World War II hangars. Interestingly, inside that hangar was a PA-11 I would eventually take to Alaska on what would be by far my favorite ferry to date, but I didn't know that at the time. Walking around the outside of the hangar, I found this really sketchy looking ladder that led all the way to the top. So, of course, I had to climb it. The sketchy looking ladder got even more sketchy the higher I climbed it, but I made it to the top without dying, so I guess I can't judge it too harshly. I'm also really glad the sketchiness of the ladder didn't stop me from climbing it, as the view from the top was absolutely stunning. I sat atop the hangar for a while, just drinking in the royal purple sunset and thinking, sometimes taking chances on sketchy things ends up being so worth it. But then I turned around and had to go back down that sketchy ladder, and oh my god, how could I be so dumb? I mean, seriously, I fall at this height and you'd be toast. Okay, we made it down safely. I am so glad we took the chance on that sketchy ladder. That sunset, I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The next morning was spent preparing for the crossing into Canada. Honestly, crossing into Canada really isn't that hard. It's just a matter of getting all the paperwork together. The airport I chose to do the crossing at was called Whetstone, and it's on the border between Alberta and Montana. I mean, like literally on the border. The runway is the border. Whetstone is one of 5 or 6 unique airports that are both American and Canadian because they lie on the border. Most of these airports have their roots traced back to World War II, where we were giving the Canadians airplanes, but we couldn't physically fly them to Canada in support of the war before we joined it, so we just kind of left them on the border for the Canadians to pick up and use, and the airports just kind of stayed after that. I've done a bunch of border crossings, and I think using the ones that are on the line are actually really easy. Since the airport is both technically American and Canadian, you can just fly there normally, but as long as you do the correct paperwork, you can just walk over to the Canadian border station, and then they'll just wave their hands and magically your airplane, without moving, is now in Canada and not America. It's kind of confusing, but overall, I think the process is a lot easier than using some of the other border crossing stations. Crossing into Canada was really not that much of a hassle at all. The only thing they cared a lot about was if we had any guns with us. They asked us about 5 times if we had guns, and even said, "Oh, you're going to Alaska and you don't have guns? What kind of American are you?" Which I thought that was kind of funny. But we just told them no, and they didn't search our plane, so it was relatively easy. So even though our airplane didn't move at all, with the swipe of a pen, we were now technically in Canada. So we continued on the trip. Flying in Canada really isn't that much different than flying in the United States. There are some airspace differences and some other minor things that just make it a little bit different than the United States, but one of the main things that I noticed that was really different from the United States was just the general lack of airports everywhere. The lack of airports kind of exacerbated the fuel range problem on the PA-12, so we had to make a couple more stops than probably would be necessary. We made a quick stop in High River, which was the first Canadian airport I had landed at, and I didn't really know what to expect, but really it was about the same other than the fuel station being in liters and having a separate section in French. We continued on around Calgary's airspace up to Drayton Valley, where the prairies and farmers' fields started turning into pine trees and oil fields. With a quick fill-up in Drayton Valley, we continued on in the beautiful flying weather up to our final stop for the day of Grand Prairie. However, the good flying weather was short-lived, as the next morning there was just scattered low clouds and general crap just hanging around everywhere. After we took off from Grand Prairie, our slow speed was highlighted by the helicopter that absolutely blasted past us like we were standing still. The weather had opened up enough to get us to our next stop of Fort St. John, but the next leg to Fort Nelson was pretty dodgy. An important note is that this part of Canada is where the radar coverage ended, and there's basically 0 divert options between Fort St. John and Fort Nelson. One of the main weather resources I used was the highway traffic cameras that you could tune into online and get a live look at what the weather was actually doing along the route. Using traffic cameras to get a better idea of what the weather is actually doing between reporting stations is a technique I discovered on this trip, but I've used it since on a lot of different ferries, and it's useful in more than just Canada. We sat around in Fort St. John just waiting on the weather basically all day, and it wasn't too bad because there were some cool airplanes running around like this Lockheed Electra. That was pretty cool. But eventually the weather opened up and I made the decision to launch to Fort Nelson. We picked our way through some of the clouds that were just hanging around on the way to Fort Nelson, and honestly it was kind of nice compared to the clear in a million flights we had done a bunch before. I'm really glad I had delayed the decision to launch to Fort Nelson as much as I did because, as we made our approach to the airport, you could tell that there was a really low cloud layer that had just evacuated. Unfortunately, the waiting around robbed us of the light to continue on, so we parked the PA-12 next to an old radial Stinson and found a ride into town. Though we got up early the next morning, fog rolled in and again delayed our departure. The next leg to Waxon Lake was at the very edge of our fuel range, and once again, there were no other early divert options if we happened to find that the headwinds were stronger than expected. Thankfully, I had done my research ahead of time and found a private strip called Toad River, situated along the Alcan Highway just across from a small lodge and gas station. Since the airport was listed as a private strip, I called the number showing for the airport manager, and it turned out that that number was for the lodge restaurant. I asked if I could get permission to land at the grass strip across the road, and they seemed absolutely bewildered. I explained that this was the number listed as the airport manager and asked if they could just get me in contact with somebody who could give me permission to land. They were still very confused and said that the lodge didn't control the landing strip, and according to them, no one really controlled it, so that sounded like permission enough for me, as not running out of fuel was a top priority of mine. Toad River ended up being one of my favorite places to stop on the trip to Alaska. I've done it a couple times on some other ferries. It's nestled right in the foothills here before some of the Sirius Mountains, and though there is some terrain that you kind of got to navigate on the approach, it's really not hard at all. One of the hardest things about it is just trying to find the dang thing if you've never been there before, because it kind of gets covered up by the trees and it just can be really difficult to find. The easiest way to find it is just to follow the highway until you hit the lodge and then just look right across the road from the lodge, and it should be that little strip right there. The approach is relatively easy. I mean, you got the tall trees on the one side and the power lines on the other that you got to make sure you don't hit, but you just drop yourself in on that, and even though it's relatively short with not great go-around options depending on the airplane you have, it's relatively benign, and I really enjoyed the landing here. It's a pretty smooth strip as well, so you could get some decent planes in and out of this place. One of the things that I've found that's really hard to portray on camera is the feeling that you get after you battle some of this weather and fly into the mountains and places you've never been before, and some of the terrain can be really challenging, and then you make a, somewhat challenging, but not super crazy, but, somewhat challenging approach into an airport you've never been to before, and you land, and you shut down, and you just sit there in awe of all that you just experienced, and you just have this great sense of feeling of just, man, I freaking love aviation, life is freaking awesome, and this trip is super cool. And that's the feeling I want to leave with you in this video. In the next video, there's higher terrain and some more ridiculous weather that I've got to battle on the way to Alaska. So if that sort of thing interests you, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching. See ya.